Hello. Today we'll be discussing the O.J. Simpson case. This is a very complex and convoluted case, so rather than giving you the detailed blow by blow, I'm just going to go over some of the highlights of the case. So the case took place in Los Angeles, California, and the crime itself occurred on the night of June 12th, 1994. So we have two victims here: Nicole Brown Simpson, who was the ex-wife of former football player O.J. Simpson, and her friend Ronald, or Ron Goldman, were brutally stabbed to death in Nicole Brown Simpson's home. And perhaps the reason why the case is so famous and so remembered is because we have the involvement of a very famous celebrity, Orenthal James, or O.J. Simpson, who was and still is the prime suspect in this case. So O.J. Was a very well-known and respected football player. He started playing football in college at USC. He then was a running back for the Buffalo Bills for 9 years. And after that, he joined the San Francisco 49ers and he played for them for about 2 years. He was inducted into the National Football Hall of Fame, and he was a Heisman Trophy winner as well. After his sports career, he went on to become a sports commentator. He also went on to act in a number of TV shows and films. If you remember the Naked Gun film series, he was in all of those films. So in the mid 90s, when this occurred, OJ was really at the top of his game and was just really famous and adored by the public. And so I think these factors, among others, led to a lot of media interest and public interest in this case. And the case itself uh, was very sensational. Um, if you talk to anyone that was alive during this period of time and old enough to remember, uh, they will probably tell you that this case was everywhere. Everybody was talking about it. It was all over the news. It was all over the internet. There was no aspect of society that this case did not penetrate in some way. The entire trial was televised live every day, and all the networks were covering it. And so, not only did you have that, but then you also had a lot of the kind of, as we've come to know on these news channels, the talking head commentary about what occurred that day during the trial. Um, the case was reported on the radio, it was reported in newspapers, it was reported on the internet, which was just really starting to become popular at that point in time. The case was just everywhere, and it dragged on for nearly 2 years. So, for that period of time, every day you'd be hearing something about O.J. Simpson or what occurred with the case. So, the media really was all over this from pretty much day one, and there was a lot of public interest in this case, to say the least. Having lived through this period myself, I can say honestly that it was probably one of the biggest news stories that I remember and of my generation. Um, so beyond that, though, there were a lot of interesting legal issues that we'll talk about. The trial and the verdict led to a great deal of controversy. We see a lot of racial issues in this, again, this division, this racial division within the United States, very much played into public opinion about the case. We saw some problems with the case, including incompetence on the part of the prosecution and the police, and also the mishandling of evidence. The trial itself actually started in July of 1994. And just to give you a sense of the scope of the trial, it started on July 22nd of 1994, and it ended a little over a year later on October 2nd of 1995. During that time, O.J. Simpson was in jail for about 473 days. The prosecution called 78 witnesses, and the defense called 72 witnesses. All total, the prosecution spent about $9 million trying this case, and the defense spent about $6 million. We had problems with the prosecution, the defense, and also the judge during the initial criminal trial. Marcia Clark headed up the prosecution team, and throughout the case, it was apparent that they were very poorly prepared for the case, that the prosecution was incompetent, that they were very arrogant, and that Marcia Clark especially did a very poor job of selling the case and connecting with the jurors. She also highlighted and emphasized the testimony of Detective Mark Furman with the LAPD, who, as it turns out, made some very racist comments and also perjured himself on the stand. And so you just had a very poorly handled prosecution, hinging on some very questionable ground. We had some problems with the judge as well. So the judge was Lance Ito, and Ito was very much overtaken by the celebrity status that he now had as a judge, being on television every day and interacting, with OJ and with celebrities. He was very slow in delivering his rulings, and also very inconsistent with some of the rulings that he delivered throughout the trial. And he was accused of basically stretching things out just for the sake of making good television. And so the media involvement in this case really, Ito played up on this, and it really factored into how he and some other folks in the case conducted themselves, because they knew they were on television. You also have some issues with the defense as well. The defense, specifically Johnny Cochran. A lot of people really, you either kind of hated Johnny Cochran or you loved him. There really wasn't much middle ground. He quoted the Bible quite a bit, during some of his questioning and his commentary, and his closing arguments. He also engaged in a lot of showboating for the cameras. He, at one point, compared the persecution of OJ with what happened in Nazi Germany. He used the race card a lot. And so he used a lot of these tactics that really were questionable, and it just irritated a lot of people. But at the end of the day, Cochran probably did a good job in that he did what he was paid to do, and that he got an acquittal for O.J. Simpson. You also had a lot of people complaining that the case was over prosecuted. And what this means is that the prosecution presented too much evidence. There was a lot of emphasis on the DNA evidence and the DNA aspects of this case. And it's possible that they just really overplayed this, and that it was very confusing for the jury. So we see a lot of problems really with all parties in this case. Um, we also see some racial issues here. So a polling that was conducted after the trial showed that there was about a 50-50 split in terms of people's belief in O.J. Simpson's guilt or innocence. So predominantly, about 50% of the population, the white population, believed that OJ was guilty and that the verdict itself was not just. However, we saw a lot more African Americans believing in OJ Simpson's innocence and saying that they believe that the verdict itself was just when OJ was eventually acquitted. We also see an interesting problem here in the difference in the verdicts. So OJ was found not guilty during the criminal proceedings, but he was found liable for the deaths a year later during the civil proceedings. So after the criminal trial had concluded, OJ was back in court again because of wrongful death suits that had been filed by the Goldmans and the Browns. Now, I should mention here that the civil trial and civil court is a lot different. The standards of evidence are much lower in the civil proceedings, and so even though OJ was found not guilty during the criminal trial, where the burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, the evidence was still enough to find OJ liable for wrongful death in the civil proceedings because there's a lower burden of proof there. The burden of proof is the preponderance of the evidence. The civil trial also was a lot more focused and over with a lot quicker. Whereas the criminal proceedings went on for over a year, the civil proceedings took place in about 3 months, and the jury only deliberated for 17 hours, finding OJ liable for the deaths and ultimately awarding $88.5 million in punitive damages and $25 million to the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. So, some other issues that we can kind of briefly talk about is this issue of can one buy reasonable doubt? And this is brought up in the book. The Geis and Binen mentioned this issue that, can the rich buy reasonable doubt? And they contrast this to the reality that most people are represented by the public defender. So if we look at criminal proceedings and as we've discussed before, that really the O.J. Simpson case is an anomalous case. O.J. had the money to assemble the dream team. He had the money to build up his defense, but this isn't the case with most people that are tried in the criminal court systems. Most people are represented by the public defender. So you have to kind of ask yourself, what is the quality of the defense here? Okay. And I think that the saying money talks really kind of applies in that, OJ had the money and therefore had the ability to buy himself a really good defense. We also saw some issues with police perjury or testifying. This is an interesting term that was coined by one of OJ's defense attorneys, Alan Dershowitz, who referred to testifying and the fact that there was probably some perjury committed by the police in the O.J. Simpson case, specifically Mark Furman and also Detective Philip Van Adder gave testimony that was likely not true. And we see this occurring sometimes in criminal cases where the police may engage in perjury, and this is termed noble cause corruption. And it's an interesting argument, and it's the idea that police tend to believe that what they're doing is just, and that what they're doing is right, and that they are kind of that fine line between protecting the public and that they are law and order. So if they have to lie to convict somebody, or if they have to plant evidence to convict somebody, that really it's justified because ultimately they're doing the right thing. And so if we did see perjury and testifying in the O.J. Simpson case, that it was probably due to this idea of this noble cause corruption that you know what? the defendant in this case is clearly guilty. And so if we have to lie to convict him, and he gets convicted, it's not that big of a deal. But certainly that brings up a lot of ethical questions here too. Um, so that's some interesting things you can think about. And then also we have the issue of the media and cameras in the courtroom. So the whole case, as I mentioned, was televised live, and as a result of this, it's likely that several actors in the case changed uh, their behaviors and really played up and showboated and played to the cameras and played to the audience. And it really kind of brings up a question of how fair were the proceedings, and the whole thing was really turned into a media circus. And so, yes, we can have cameras in the courtroom, we can have public observations of criminal proceedings, and this is guaranteed, by the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. But then this question becomes, how fair is this, and does it really change criminal court proceedings, and does it turn the proceedings into a media circus? And in some ways, I think you can argue that the proceedings here did become a media circus. So, anyway, just to kind of recap, we have a lot of different issues going on with the O.J. Simpson case, as far as problems with the prosecution and defense, and also the judge in this case. We have a lot of racial issues here. We have the issues of media involvement, and the issues of fairness in terms of, can the rich buy reasonable doubt? We have issues of perjury. So there's a lot going on here in the O.J. Simpson case. I'm just going to end the discussion here, but again, I want you to just kind of think about these issues as you read the case, and as you think about the verdict and think about the fairness in the proceedings here. But anyway, that pretty much wraps it up for the OJ discussion. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to shoot me an email. And as always, I'd be happy to address them.